slide. And real quick, we're not going to spend a lot of time here. This just reminds you of who I am representing this evening. I am representing the New Jersey Higher Education Student Assistance Authority, or HESAA, where I actually worked for well over 13 years before moving on to become the Dean of Enrollment at Stockton University, and started many of these programs, as a matter of fact. But just want to let you know who I'm representing this evening. Let's go to the next slide. And on this slide, what I want to do, before we do a real overview of financial aid from a student and parent standpoint, I want to take this one slide in about 1 or 2 minutes and just show you financial aid from what I like to call the other side of the desk. I want you to think of financial aid from the financial aid officer's perspective. I think that helps when you're going through the process. And first and foremost, even though sometimes it doesn't seem this way, the primary goal of every financial aid officer is to assist students and their families in paying for a college education. Now, that may seem quite evident to everyone, but there are many people who think we act as a barrier. And I think you'll see why as I go through these points. But if and when you are a financial aid officer, the first thing you must do is evaluate the family's ability to pay for a college education. It's the reason why you have to file a free application for federal student aid every year, because without that evaluation, I'm powerless to help you. So again, trying to look at this from the professional, trying to look at this from the financial aid officer's point of view. Number two, distributing limited resources in an equitable manner. Please understand that when you're going through the financial aid process, we know as financial aid officers, there's not enough to go around. In fact, quite a few years back, I guess a good 3 to 4 years back, there was an excellent article done in the Wall Street Journal where they tracked close to 1,000 students. They looked at their FAFSAs, they looked at the EFC that came off of that FAFSA, and they looked at the schools they were going to, so they knew what the cost of attendance at those schools were. What they found is that for the FAFSA process to cover a student's cost, dollar for dollar, for what they show as their need, we would need to have 3 times more money in the system than we presently do. So again, the key word in that, limited. There are limited resources. Number 3, providing a balance of gift aid and self-help aid. These are 2 terms that I want you to be familiar with so they don't confuse you. If you hear somebody use the term gift aid, what they're really talking about is either scholarships or grants, sometimes called grant and aids, same thing. If you hear them say self-help, they're talking about all the different loans, college loans that you can get, and also work on campus. And then finally, if you're a financial aid officer, you must implement federal and state regulations for that college or university that you're working at. If you're getting hundreds of thousands of dollars, even millions of dollars from either the federal government or the state, you can be well rest assured that every year or every other year, an auditor is going to come to that school to make sure that you are distributing that aid that they've given you in a proper manner. So again, the financial aid officer is there to help as many parents and students as they can, knowing full well that they are responsible to do it through the regulations and guidelines that have been set up by both the state and the federal government. So again, that sometimes can seem like a barrier to parents, but it isn't. It's just the financial aid officer trying to help the parent and also protecting the school and doing it the right way. So I just wanted to take, like I said, 1 slide and 2 or 3 minutes to explain financial aid from the other side of the desk. Okay, let's get into the real nitty-gritty of financial aid. Next slide. Okay, remember, we're here to demystify or simplify the process. So here's something very easy to remember. 4 sources, 4 types. What are the 4 sources? Well, the college or university you're going to attend, that's one. The federal government with all of its programs. The state of New Jersey, who I'm representing this evening, HESAA, all of their aid programs. And then, of course, outside organizations, which are also known as private scholarships. And I always think with private scholarships, you can categorize private scholarships in 2 ways, national and local. For your local scholarships, your guidance office is the expert. You want to go to them. For those of you who want to try your hand at national level scholarships, places like FastWeb. There's other like sites out there. The one I kind of lean towards is FastWeb. These are places where you can make a profile of yourself, submit it electronically, and then have it run against thousands of national scholarships. So again, 4 sources and then 4 types. What are the 4 types? Grants, scholarships, employment, and all the different college loans. What's the difference between a grant and a scholarship? Well, a grant or a grant and aid usually means that you showed need. You either showed need on the FAFSA or you showed need on some other document that the college or university wanted you to file. With a scholarship, it's usually merit-based. The largest merit-based scholarships are academic ones, followed probably by athletic scholarships. There's also music scholarships or other talents that you may bring to the school that they would want to offer you a scholarship. So again, grants and grant and aid, need-based, scholarships, merit-based. So again, just real quick, we're doing a quick overview. Let's go to the next slide. And of course, everyone who is listening to me, if you want to get involved in the financial aid office, everyone knows that you must, no matter what school you go to, you must file what's called the free application for federal student aid or FAFSA. However, many of the students in your school are looking at what I call expensive, very competitive schools to enter. And the reason I put these two together, when you see that the school is both very expensive and highly competitive to get admitted, more likely than not, these are the schools that have the largest propensity to have you also file not only the FAFSA, but they'll also have you file something called Css Profile. The CSS stands for College Scholarship Service. Yeah, that sounds familiar. They're the folks who take care of the SATs as well. But this is another venture of theirs. And unlike the FAFSA, the CSS Profile is not free. As you can see from the slide, it's $25 for the first school and $16 for every additional school that would want you to provide them with profile data, not just FAFSA data as well. So parents especially, if you see your son or daughter looking at very competitive, which are also highly expensive schools, go out to their website. More likely than not, besides just the FAFSA, they're going to want you to file this profile. Let me give you a quick little feel for it, okay? Schools like Villanova, NYU, Boston College, Boston U, Lehigh, Lafayette, Bucknell, Holy Cross, Duke, they all use CSS Profile. So does every single Ivy League school. Rutgers, Stockton, Montclair, Temple do not use CSS Profile. So to give you a flavor of what type of schools would look to want you to file a CSS Profile, again, as I said, the more expensive and the more competitive it is to get in, the more propensity to use CSS Profile. Okay, enough with that. Well, let's go to the next slide. And of course, everything we do with the FAFSA, we do it, electronically. And when you look at the FAFSA application, I always like to characterize it as a one-step, two-step operation. Step one is to get your FSA IDs. Because this is a total electronic process and what you're doing is a legal document, you need to have a legal electronic signature. And so every student and then one parent in filing the FAFSA needs to develop this FSA ID. We'll talk about that in more detail when we get to the nitty-gritty of filing the FAFSA, but I wanted you to see that. Also, I want to remind you that when you're ready to file the FAFSA, we're under something now, this is fairly new, it's only the last 3 years, a term called prior year. What that means is when you're sitting there filling out the 22-23 academic year FAFSA for your son or daughter who's going to be a freshman in the 22-23 year, you're actually using the 2020 federal tax return, not the 2021, but the 2020. And for most of you, the vast majority of you, that means it's a completed return. You've long since filed your 2020 tax return. So again, we'll get into more detail of this when we get to the real nitty-gritty of the FAFSA itself. but I wanted you to see this as part of the overview. Okay, let's move on. Why are you filing the FAFSA in the first place? You're filing it so that the federal processor can develop something that's called the Expected Family Contribution, or EFC. So when they get all of your data, you filled out all 104, 105 questions on the FAFSA, where does it go? It goes to this federal processor electronically, and they put it through something that's called federal methodology. This is the way they take and massage your numbers to come up with this expected family contribution. And the expected family contribution is a measurement of the family's financial strength or ability to pay for a college education. So the EFC is a very important part of this. Next slide. Cost of attendance. I don't want you to be confused with this. Cost of attendance is purely a financial aid term, because in cost of attendance, what we are doing as financial aid officers, we are developing a cost of attendance for each child, for each student, I should say, and we are putting in it not only the immediate cost of the school, which is tuition and fees and room and board if you're living on campus, but all of these other costs that both the state and the feds recognize. So the cost of attendance and the actual immediate bill that you would get from the school each semester are completely different from each other. Cost of attendance is always somewhere between $4,000 to $6,000 more than what your immediate costs at the college are. So don't confuse the two. So again, cost of attendance, expected family contribution, let's put them all together. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to skip this one. Okay, real quick. Remember what I said, 4 sources, 4 types. The 4 sources and types of aid, the federal government has their major programs, and their major one is called the Pell Grant program, okay? Pell Grant, it's the largest of the federal programs. Folks, for anyone who can hear my voice so that you don't get frustrated with the financial aid process in and of itself, please, I want to remind you of something or tell you something that you might not realize. Since the inception of all federal programs, which are called Title IV funds, they have always been intended, legally and every other thing else, for the highest need, lowest income students. So all federal programs are for the highest need, lowest income students. Many of the folks at Edison High School don't fall into that category. Probably well over half of the students attending Edison do not fall into that category. It doesn't mean you're not eligible for aid. It just means you might not get these particular federal programs such as the Pell Grant or SEOG. Just want to make that aware so you're not frustrated with the process. Let's go to the next slide real quick. Okay, we went to the feds. Now here's the state. The state's a little different than the feds. The state has a larger blanket of people, a wider swath of people that they're going to help. So Pell is the largest of the federal programs. TAG, which stands for Tuition Aid Grant, TAG is the largest of the state grants. Last year, just to use that as an example, last year, a little over 77,000 people received a TAG grant from the state of New Jersey. A little over $244 million of TAG money was distributed throughout the state of New Jersey at all the different students, all the different colleges they attended. That's $50 million more than the federal Pell Grant program. That is something very unique. There is only 1 or 2 states in the entire 50 states that can say that their state grant is larger than the federal Pell Grant, and we're in one of them. And as you people know, since you live in New Jersey, we have some poor folk in the state, but not 77,000 families worth. So certainly TAG is covering a far larger swath of eligible students. That's the good news. What's the bad news? State money can only stay at in-state colleges. So if you're looking to attend in Pennsylvania or Florida or North Carolina or New York, you cannot take the TAG grant or any of these other state grants with you across the border. Just keep that in mind. I don't want to take up a lot of time with this, but because we have to go on to the detail of the FAFSA. But as you can see from this slide, there are a number of programs that the state of New Jersey has put together, because the state of New Jersey for at least, oh gosh, at least 15, 20 years now have, and it didn't matter which administration was in, whether it was a Democrat or Republican, didn't matter who was governor, but they have all stayed with the same theme. And that is, they do not want finances to be an excuse used for a student to not attend school. So if you show need, or if you show academic prowess, or a combination of the two, there's a program here that will probably help you through that. Let's go to the next slide, because we have a couple of brand new ones that came up too. Oh, we're into the other one now. Okay. Well, before we do that, before we get into the actual FAFSA, let me put everything together for you. Remember, if you go back to the slides that we talked about, expected family contribution and cost of attendance, what I want you to remember is this, that no matter what school you go to, for that financial aid officer to put a financial aid package together for you, they are going to take the data that they got from your FAFSA that tells them what your expected family contribution is, EFC, and they're going to subtract that number from your cost of attendance, because that will then tell them what your total need is. So let me give you a quick example. Let's pretend, in my example, you've applied to Rutgers University. Cost of attendance for in-state living on campus at Rutgers, New Brunswick, probably runs around $35,000 in-state on campus for the cost of attendance. In our example, we're going to say you filed your FAFSA and you showed an EFC of $15,000. Well, if I take the cost of 35, cost of attendance, subtract the 15, that means you have a need for $20,000. And that financial aid office is going to do its best to put together a financial aid package worth $20,000. Might not get there, but that's what they're trying to do. Whether it's a combination of scholarships, grants, work, loans, that's what their goal would be. So I wanted to give you that quick example just to put everything together as we go through that overview of how the financial aid process works. Now, I think Sunyi wants me to go into the more specifics of the FAFSA itself. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So
okay.
For this portion,
with that in mind, and Cindy's going to help me with this. It's going to be a duo here. I'm going to lead the way, but I know she's going to interject with me as well. Remember what I said in the beginning. It is a one-step, two-step operation. So step one is going to be getting those electronic signatures, or FSA IDs, as we say. So let's go on to the next slide. And again, the FSA ID is just a username or password used by the student and the parent to identify you. Remember what we said, this document, this FAFSA, is a legal document. And so we want to make sure that you're able to sign off on it and have the security that you would need in sharing this financial data and this information about you and your family through the federal processor. And that's what we're doing here when you're looking at the FSA ID. So every student would need an FSA ID, and the parent can use their FSA ID for each student who's in college at the same time. So let's say we had a family that has twins. Okay, the parent would have one FSA ID, and then that parent would use it on both of the twins' FAFSAs as they were filling it out. Because yes, you're filling out one for each of the students. So again, the parent one can be used for 1, 2, 3, 4, as many students as are going to school at the same time. And each individual student needs their own separate, distinct FSA ID for the student. Okay? All right. And here's some of the detail of it. But again, as Ms. Muglia has mentioned to me, many of you have already done the FSA ID part of this or at least that's what I'm led to believe. Very
Yes.
simple process, takes really less than 5 minutes.
So when you go on to fsaid.ed.gov, they will ask you a number of security questions, contact information. More importantly, I always stress and emphasize that you use an email address that you often will have access to. So for my students, you need to make an FSA ID as a student, and then your parent makes an FSA ID, right? But not many of us know that once you've graduated, your Edison High School email addresses will be deactivated. So you're going to be using the same FSA ID when you renew and when you reapply for FAFSA. With each year that you're enrolled in the university level, you have to do FAFSA every single year. So we strongly encourage that you use an email address, a personal email address that you have constant access to, so that you can always retrieve your account. So let's see. So you want to make sure that, you have so when you input your social security number and your date of birth, your name must match exactly what is on your social security card. For me, for example, when I was applying for federal student aid, I have, a multi-syllable spaced together, sometimes spaced apart, 2 words in my name. You want to make sure it just matches. So my social security, Sinyi, is 1 word. So you want to make sure that everything's accurate. NJ Dreamers do not register for the FSA ID because we are not, you will be doing another application. I don't know if Mr. Iacovelli, you wanted to elaborate on that process.
Sure.
But it is on HESAA.org.
Correct. It's called the alternative financial aid form. And you would go out, as Sinyi just mentioned, you would go out to HESAA.org. So if you are not a US citizen, which means you cannot file the free application for federal student aid, you can file the state one. And especially if you're going to attend school within the state of New Jersey, it would be very smart on your part to go out and do that alternative one, because you may well be eligible for state aid within the state of New Jersey if you attend any of our in-state schools. So please look into that. It's HESAA.org and look for the alternative financial aid form and go through that system instead of the FAFSA if you're not a US citizen.
So we had a question about how do you link your FSA ID to each of your kids. So we will get to that in further down in this presentation, but what you're using the FSA ID for basically is at the end of the application, you have to make that electronic signature before you get to the confirmation page, before your FAFSA report gets sent to the colleges. So there's 1 signature from a parent and 1 signature for students. It gets linked once you're completing the application. When you are doing so, you can use either one. You can either use your student one or your parent one. As we go through the page, it'll ask for parental information, and that's when you're going to input your social security number again, and that's how you're going to link the accounts more or less. But you can use either accounts to start that application. So very basic information. You can also input your mobile number for account recovery. So I've had many students that, maybe they forgot their password or security questions, and they can also verify your security based on your mobile number, and they'll text you a valid code. All right, and I'm filtering questions as we are going through the slides. You can also click show text to see what you're typing. Answering your challenge questions is one way to unlock your account. We've also, if you do have, problems logging on later on, we will be offering various FAFSA workshops provided by certain universities such as Middlesex County College, as well as one-on-ones with our college counselors to help you retrieve your accounts. We can help you give a call to the FAFSA as well. So again, I mentioned security codes by verifying with your mobile number. verifying with your email. So if whenever you need to retrieve your account, you can always, they can always send you a security code. So there's more and more in terms of the tightness of the security, since it does contain your social security as well as your tax information. Another thing to note is once you make an FSA ID, it does take about 24 hours for the Social Security Administration to verify it in their system. So like the IRS, for example. So you might not be able to have it activated right away. So you can register for an FSA ID, but it will take time for the SSA to activate your FSA ID.
And Sinyi, they tell us that it's never more than 24 to 36 hours, never.
24 to 36 hours, that's correct. And then
never more than that. They emphasize that. So
usually you get right. Usually when you log back on using the you create a username and password, and then when you log back on, it'll have a green check indicating that it's been verified, that your name matches your social security number. So now we're going to move on to the actual FAFSA application. We are going to be filling out the 2022-2023 application, because that is the year our seniors are going to be freshmen in college. When you get to this page under studentaid.gov or fafsa.gov, you will see, you'll see this homepage, either a returning user or start here. Either one would work. A great thing about the technologies of FAFSA is you can always start the application. You don't have to finish it on the spot. You can always come back and save your responses for later. So I wanted to emphasize, like I did before, that once you both parent and student has the FSA ID, either or, you can use either your FSA ID for the student or the parent to get started. And once the parent and student are linked, then you can, either one can log on to complete the application. So you can click either or. I am student. So again, as I mentioned, this slide is from last year. This should say, again, you are not starting, you should start with the one on the left. It should say 2022-2023.
Correct.
And when I post this PowerPoint onto our counseling webpage, it will be amended. This video recording will also be on YouTube on our channel, and it will be posted on the counseling webpage as well. So I'll let Mr. Iacovelli, you can continue. The next step is to create a safe key. It can be just a few digits, it's basically a secondary password. Okay. The student logs on to FSA. So when you log on with your FSA ID, with the student FSA ID, you're going to start the application with the student information section, where you are filling in the student demographics. You will see that preloaded already is the social security number of the students, and you're essentially going to complete, you're going to verify again your first name, last name, and date of birth. You're going to verify, it gets a little redundant, you're going to verify again and re-enter your email as well as your mobile number. So we had a question about, so again, we had a question, Mr. Iacovelli, whether or not you can fill out both FAFSA and HESAA.
All right, that means I haven't given a good vision of this. So let me answer that question by saying this. When you file the FAFSA, there are three major things that happen when you file the FAFSA. Number one, about a day or two after you filed it, they will get back to you with something called an ESAR, Electronic Student Aid Report. That's your way of knowing that they received it, and they're going to do what they're supposed to do with it. And one of the things they're supposed to do is send that data electronically to all of the schools that you listed at the very end of the FAFSA. I think there's room for either 8 or 10 schools. Number three, they're going to, because they see you have a New Jersey address, your FAFSA data automatically goes to HESAA. So there's no separate thing here. It's all together. You file the one FAFSA, it goes to the schools that you want it to go to so they can make up packages for you. It comes back to you so you can verify, yep, you got my stuff and it's working the way I want it to work. And number three, they see your address is New Jersey and your information is also going off to HESAA to be loaded into their, what they call the New Jersey Financial Aid Management System, or FAMS. So that's the vision I want you to have. You're just filling out the FAFSA and all these things are happening for you automatically because you filed the FAFSA properly.
So it will load to both state and federal, in other words.
Correct. And to the schools.
Yes.
State, feds, and to the schools that you requested.
So I just wanted to emphasize too that there is the option for permanent residents to fill out. If you are in the process of obtaining legal citizenship, permanent citizenship. So there are different options. And then if you would like, right now, for all attendants, really, you can submit your questions in the chat box. So under student information, you are going to click that you are obtaining your first bachelor's degree. When you begin your 2022-2023 school year.
A lot of people make an error there. I don't know why, but they read it wrong. That is one of the questions that can delay things. Please make sure that you understand that. It says, will you have your first bachelor's degree before the end of the, no, you won't. You're just starting it. And so many students will put yes as if they're thinking about their high school degree, and they're not asking that. They're asking for your first bachelor's degree. So please be aware of that, folks.
So you will click never attended college, and this will be your
first year student. Yep.
And again, 2022-2023 is the school year that you are applying for.
Right.
Regarding selective service system, if you're a male, you have to click yes. This will also register you if you have not already been registered.
Correct.
You are a male with the age 18 to 25. Just driver's license number. Now, there are more specific questions for students depending on their dependency status. If you answer certain questions about whether you've had a change in legal guardianship, oftentimes it will skip certain questions about the parental section, and it will basically skip a lot of the financial questions. And then we will get to that in a second. So as you see on the third tab here, dependency status, that they will verify that after school selection. So once you've completed the student demographics, it will ask you to name up to 10 colleges, as well as first our high school. You would input our high school, the name of the high school, Edison High School, and then it will link you to your high school. The next thing after you link us to Edison High School is you can select it from a number of selections. You can click in just, it basically runs a report for all the high school districts.
Right.
So after you complete information about our school, you're going to plug in the college list that you plan to apply to. Now you can plug in up to 10 universities. If you know the federal school code, usually this is listed on the college website when you are applying. You can also do a search. You can run a search. There is a search tool at the bottom right where you can, when you start, so we had a question, when you're starting to fill the form in, do we select your student or parent? So either or, you can start as a parent or student. If you start as a parent, if you see here under parent demographics, it will start the application off by making you fill in information about the parents. If you start the application as a student, it will start you off on the first point where you see on the top right here under student demographics. And all it will ask you is where you go to school, what is your address, your phone number, and driver's license. What is the right way to start? Either or. You may start either or because you will fill in both. So you can use either your student's FSA ID to start or the parents. It does not make a difference. You can log back in with the same FSA ID. No. So another question is, for the parent and students, they do not have the same FSA ID. Once again, there's one FSA ID that you create based on your social security number, and the student has to have their own FSA ID, which is linked to their social security number. And at the end of the application, you sign electronically with both FSA IDs, but you can log into the application with either one. So as you're continuing on, once you've added your high school, the next step, this is step 2, is to complete the school selection. As I mentioned before, you can add the up to 10 colleges. And within the 10 colleges, you're going to search for their federal school code. You can choose whether or not you will be on campus, off campus, or living at home. Mr. Iacovelli, do you know how, in terms of that selection, would that make a difference in when they're filing?
The only difference that makes is that you're giving them the information so they can develop the cost of attendance that they're going to use for you. So for instance, go back to my example, Rutgers. You could either be commuting to Rutgers, you could be living on campus. You're an in-state student, and they'll know that because of your address, but there's different costs of attendance that are developed for the on-campus student versus the commuting student. And so that's where that really helps when they're developing all the things that I showed you previously on the overview of financial aid.
Thank you. So we have a question about whether or not you can apply to more than 10. Can you send the report to more than 10 colleges?
In the beginning, the answer is no. You send it to the top 10. When within 24 to 48 hours, you're going to get that electronic student aid report back. When you get that back, you can then add further colleges to it. But on the initial FAFSA, you're limited to 10, but then you have that choice as soon as you hear back from the federal processor, which, as I said, is usually no more than a day or two, 24 to 48 hours. And it's called an electronic student aid report, the way they get back to you. And on that, you would be able to request further schools to receive your data as well, if for some reason you needed more than 10 schools.
Thank you. We had another question about, can you change your decision later? In terms of dorming versus the housing plan?
Of course. Yes, you can change at any time, but this initial data tells you what they're probably going to use to develop your initial package, because that's the cost of attendance that they're going to use. Your cost of attendance is going to be higher if you're a resident student than if you're a commuting student. Probably be higher by quite a few $1,000s, as a matter of fact. But that's what they're using. But if you change and you let them know you're changing, they'll do a recalculation for you. That's very easy, and it's done dozens and dozens of times at every school every year.
So I wanted to move on to the next page, but before we do so, we had a question about when to start, when to complete this application.
Um, I
Before,
can,
after
I,
deadline?
I can interject on that one if you'd like.
Yes, please.
Obviously, October 1st was when you could first start. I always tell students, no matter what school they're going to, 2-year, 4-year, public, private, competitive, non-competitive, doesn't matter. Try to get your FAFSA done before Thanksgiving. That's the way I usually tell students. If between now and Thanksgiving you get it done, don't sweat it. There is no difference between getting it done October 15th versus getting it done October 20th. There's no difference between getting it done October 20th versus October 30th. But when you get beyond late November, then because of the limited amount of resources that these schools have when they're packaging, and on top of that, you looking to make decisions, you're really hurting yourself if you let this go beyond Thanksgiving, because once you start getting acceptances from the schools, whenever the acceptance comes, they can then give you a financial aid package. You'll never get a financial aid package before the admissions office has accepted you. But once they have accepted you, they want to quickly get a package into your hands. So knowing that, you certainly do not want to go past Thanksgiving time period. Then I would say you're starting to get into what would be considered a little late, and you might be hurting yourself.
Great, thank you. This will also, so as if everyone can see, this page is based off of whether or not you started the application with your student FSA ID or with the parent. So if you log on to the FAFSA with your parent FSA ID, you are always going to start the first page under parent demographics, right next to where it says dependency status. So in this mock screenshot, can everyone see the PowerPoint? Yes. Mr. Iacovelli, can you still see the PowerPoint?
Oh, yes,
Yes.
I can see it. Apparently one of our viewers cannot, but I can.
No worries. I can, I will send this later as a PDF as well.
Okay.
So when you start the application with your student FSA ID, like let's say you logged on from the very beginning, you will start by filling out the student information. So when you see, we are now up to step 3. Now we've completed the student demographics, school selection. We have completed the 10 schools. Then it comes to the dependency status. So the dependency status is the students. Now, is the student married or single? That would determine their dependency status. Okay. So this is it. We're still at the student demographics. It will also ask whether or not the student has dependents. Does the student have children? You may not, as of this past fiscal year. Okay. I mentioned before, it may ask the student whether or not they are legally, or were they emancipated, the student was emancipated, or does someone other than your parent or step parent have legal guardianship? We have students who were either legally emancipated or they're living with a legal guardian, maybe even an aunt who has taken over legal guardianship. So when they click this piece, any of these, it would sometimes skip the parent demographics altogether. But if you click none of the above, it will jump you to the next page. So it will also ask whether or not the student had been homeless or self-supporting youth. We do have, a homeless district liaison in our district. That's Mr. Richard Benedict. If you have any information and you need information, you can email or contact me. Okay. Special circumstances. This is still regarding if you are unable to provide parental information. If a student just cannot provide information about the parent, there's extenuating circumstances, then they can make an appointment with the financial aid officer at that institution. Mr. Iacovelli, do you have anything to add in terms of, before we get to the next page regarding the parent demographics?
Not much. The only thing I can tell you is the intent of this. The vast majority of students are dependent. I mean, the vast majority of you. And if you're not, you're going to have to prove it by what we call third-party documentation. You must have been physically removed. You must have been removed from your home, either because of physical or mental abuse. And you'd have to be able to document that, either through police records, through clergy, through social workers. So the vast majority of people are dependent. And the fact that your parent may have a conversation with you saying, I don't want to help you with college, doesn't make you independent. Please remember that. You'll need their cooperation in filing this form. And if they don't, it may impede you from getting aid just because they said, I'm not going to support you going to college. We don't have ways to get around that. So understand that. You are more likely than not, everyone listening from my voice, you're probably at 18 years old, you're dependent on your parents unless you have documentation that shows that you're not. And if you don't have that documentation, you must file it as a dependent, and you must get the parents to cooperate and help file this form.
Now we are on to the parent demographics. So once again, if you started the application with your parent FSA ID, this is the first page that pops up when you are starting the application. It just switches basically just switches the order of when you're filling in this information. You're going to be, if we did have questions about parents that are separated, maybe they're filing their taxes differently. Could you give us more information about who they should use?
Absolutely. In cases where there is the parents have divorced or legally separated, what the FAFSA clearly tells you is that you want the parent who is the custodial parent to file the form. That's the parent that you live with the most. So if your parents are divorced or separated, which one are you living with? Now, if the one that you're living with has remarried, that means you have a step parent. And unfortunately, by the rules of the FAFSA, you would then have to put not only your custodial parent, your biological parent, but also that step parent's information, financial information on your FAFSA. But the non-custodial does not go on the FAFSA. For any of you who have to file Css Profile, they're going to want information from both the custodial and the non-custodial parent. But that's a different form. Before the FAFSA, it's just the custodial parent. Who do you live with the most since your parents are divorced or legally separated?
Great, thank you. So I also believe that an easy way to determine is what address is listed on the student's transcript or on their driver's license.
That's always a giveaway.
That is the one that they're looking for.
Yep. They want that consistency. And let me interject something here so it doesn't confuse students. I have seen dozens upon dozens of situations where the custodial parent is not the one claiming the child on their taxes. I've seen dozens and dozens of cases where the non-custodial parent is claiming the child on the income tax. So that has nothing to do with filing the FAFSA. Don't think that's going to confuse the federal processor or confuse your financial aid officer. It will not, because they see it all the time. All they want is the truth and the consistency of who the custodial parent is. Because as you fill this out year after year, it's the same custodial parent, and it's the same all the way through. We're not flip-flopping back and forth between parents.
So really, you're just using the one parent, one FSA ID, parent one.
That's
You
it.
fill out the basic information. And this is the part where you're going to link the student to the parents within the FAFSA application. When you are inputting the email address you used for the FSA ID and the social security number up top. You'll also have the opportunity to put your parent two. It doesn't matter which one, which order, you can use either parent if you're filed jointly. So same process, you put the social security number and the parent's date of birth. So it would say, have your parents lived in New Jersey for the last 5 years, just to verify residency. We'll very specifically ask you for the household size, how many students currently are attending university on the very bottom. This really is based off of who you're claiming on your tax return when it talks about the dependency. So they live with your parents provide more than half of their support. Your parents will continue to provide more than half of the support from July 1st, 2022, it should say, to 2023, right? So you're going to add, number of other dependents within the household size.
Right.
So now we get to parental financials with the tax return. This should say 2020. You are using your tax return from 2020. It's always the prior year. Here on the bottom, you will see that there's an IRS retrieval tool. When you click where it says link to the IRS, it will pop up a new page through the IRS Gov website. This is actually the safest and the quickest way to basically preload all of your tax information, your adjusted gross income.
It's also the best way, because the vast majority of you, because it is prior year, you're dealing off of a completed 2020 tax return. And so if it is a completed 2020 tax return, make sure you go through the IRS data retrieval tool. Here's the reason why. It's not that you can't put the numbers in yourself, but all initial FAFSAs coming through the federal processor, you have close to a 7 in 10 chance. You have close to a 70% chance, because you're a brand new person coming into the system, of going through what's called the federal verification process. That's the federal government's euphemistic way of saying you're going to get audited, because it's the first time you're coming through. They want you to prove what you put on the thing is for real. Because you've hit the link that says you got my data directly from the IRS data retrieval tool, it makes if you are selected for federal verification process, it makes it far easier and quicker, because you went through the IRS data retrieval tool. Because if you did that, they know you didn't put the information down there. It came directly from the IRS. So very important to remember that when you're filing it, especially since the vast majority of your parents are filling it out from a completed 2020 return.
But in order to use the IRS data retrieval tool, or the DRT, you have to do another login, basically, with your parent FSA ID. That's how it will automatically sync it. If you follow these steps and everything matches, it should take you no more than, I would say, a class period to complete this step. This is what it would look like when you proceed to the IRS site. You would leave the page, but you would really open a new tab. And when you are trying to retrieve your tax return in the database, in the IRS database, you have to put everything exactly as it is. Sometimes I've had, when we used to do the application with the parents during appointments, sometimes even the address, the spelling of drive, for example, or avenue, if your tax return states avenue, like it spells the whole word out, you just have to make sure it exactly matches what is listed on your 1040.
And can I interject here as well?
Absolutely.
There are a lot of people who go by nicknames, and so much so that they even have the nicknames on their checking accounts. When they sign something day to day, they use their nicknames. When you're filing the FAFSA, there has to be an exact match with the name and the social security number. So whatever name shows on the social security card, that's the name that you use. I always use my wife as an example. Since the time my wife was born, she's Irish, and her nickname has been Cassie, Cassie, and everybody calls her Cassie. But on her social security card, it says Kathleen with a K. So if she were filling out my three children's FAFSAs, and she made the mistake of putting Cassie instead of Kathleen, which is actually her legal name on the social security card, it'll cause delays. It's an error. It won't match up social security wise. So please remember that when you're filing any of these things, whether it's with the data retrieval tool or whether it's with developing the FSA ID for a student or a parent. You may go 24/7. You may use your nickname, but there has to be an exact match between the social security card name and this legal document. So please keep that in mind.
So within the retrieval tool, it will ask you to transfer your tax information. If you don't, sometimes this retrieval tool does encounter problems. Technology is not perfect. I already see there's a student who is having issues with transferring that information from the IRS retrieval tool. Mm-hmm. So if you don't get this checkpoint for retrieving your 2020 tax return information, there are other ways that you can manually input your tax information. For example, if you have a hard copy of your 1040 ready, and I did encourage some parents as they were attending this workshop to have on hand, it will list the lines asking how much that they earn in 2020 for each parent, and to add up lines 1, Schedule 1's line 3, box 14 of the IRS Schedule K1, the Form 1065. So if they're filing jointly, Mr. Iacovelli,
yes.
Sometimes this will be a different number than the two parents might have a different number, or if they're filing together, sometimes
if they're filing jointly, they will be together, but sometimes the tax accountant or someone else recommends that they file separately. Mm-hmm. So you have married who file separately, then you're adding the two together.
Right. So should these two then be the same if they are joint? The first box and the second box? Since they share the same 1040, it's asking for the same lines. So it's
yeah. And where we're at right now, let me get my reading glasses on as well. But where we are right now is more W-2 information than it is the actual tax return information. Here, they are asking you from the box to separate out what the wages for let's say both parents work. What are the wages of the father? What are the wages of the mother?
Right.
That's what's going on here.
It will not be double counted. So
No,
other parents, we have they ask. So I want to emphasize as we're going to further down the pages that 0 is a number. So you never want to leave anything blank.
Correct.
Even if filing jointly. So we have a parent who, the Schedule 1, we indicated did parents file Schedule 1? So if you are only filed a Schedule 1 to report
To report unemployment.
yes. So we have someone, a parent had asked, if they can't find their Schedule 1, does it mean that does it pertain to them? Yeah. Or should they just click no? This is really a question for the person who is preparing the taxes, right? The tax advisor. The parents.
And again, it only applies when you have unemployment compensation.
Correct. So there is an option for you to click yes, no, or don't know. And there's a link for more information. So it may be that not everyone has a Schedule 1 on their tax returns.
The vast majority do not.
Right. Okay. They'll ask whether or not your parents or you, or, however it is worded, right? So now, we're still at the parent information. Any dislocated workers. It will also ask in 2020 whether or not you received benefits or federal benefit programs, such as SNAP, free and reduced lunch, school lunch, TANF, and any supplemental security income. So you click any and all to your knowledge. Again, this should say income tax for 2020. It will ask you to the total amount on line 14 minus Schedule 2 on line 2. So we had a question. So this again, why is FAFSA asking for this tax information if you can retrieve it from the IRS data tool? Basically, your 1040 is retrievable. This is just the manual way to input that information.
Because an answer to that question is if you were going through IRS data retrieval, you wouldn't be answering these questions.
Correct. This is just the manual way if there is any issues that come up with the IRS retrieval tool.
Right.
You are not leaving anything blank. You are not leaving it blank. If you're filing jointly, you are completing it. You're still completing. You're going to follow the lines that are instructed. And again, 0 is a dollar amount. So even if, you're not receiving combat pay, even if education credits, IRA reductions.
Yeah, the vast majority of these will not apply to most of your students, the absolute vast, and you're telling them the right thing. Put a 0 in, don't leave it blank. This way they know you addressed the question, but it just doesn't apply to you. If you left it blank, they might think, well, you missed the question. So you communicate better by putting the 0 in if it doesn't apply to you. And most of these probably won't for the vast majority of you.
We had 2 parents ask what happens if there's an error once you sent this report. Long answer short, you can resubmit. They will identify the problems.
Yes, they will. And then they'll ask you for further data on that. It will delay you, but it won't stop the process.
Right. Next questions regarding in 2020, any child support paid because of divorce or separation, earnings from under co-op education program offered by a college. This is if you earnings from work if you work at a college, taxable earnings. So if this does not apply to you, you will still put 0.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to skip this part. There's now after the tax information, they will proceed to the assets as well as the current balance of cash, savings, and checkings.
Right.
as
Can
well
I
as
make a comment here, Ms. Muglia?
Yes.
Notice how each one of these sentences start. As of today. So I don't want you to be confused by this. When you're filing the FAFSA, on the assets, they want the information as it is today. As you're sitting down to file that FAFSA, as of today, answer the question. However, when it comes to your federal tax return, they're going back to what we call prior year. They're going all the way back to 2020. Do not let that confuse you, but be aware of it, that assets are now and immediate, and earned income was from 2020.
For the most part, our students may not be filling this portion out. This is now just regarding the student's tax filing status. Most of my students, they may have worked part-time this summer.
And they may have filed a 1040 EZ. Some know, some don't. But if they did file a 1040 EZ, then it would be, yeah, I filed the tax return. And here's the information from my little tax return. I earned $2,000 or $3,000 or whatever it was. And then you would take it off of that 1040 EZ, more likely than not. There are some parents who have tax accountants, and the tax accountant has advised, since the child was 8 or 9 or 10 years old, that we're going to file a tax return for little Johnny or little Susie. So yes, many of the students have not filed taxes because they didn't work, but for those who worked, or if you have parents who have put assets in the student's name, which means they're actually filing a tax return more because of the assets and their earnings, that can happen. Just be aware of that. If you filed the tax return, you want to make sure that you filled this out correctly, because they'll do a cross match electronically on this to see if there's something out there.
Okay.
Also, Mrs. Muglia,
yes.
let me make an overall statement here, which I think may help students when they're going through this, because we're going through question by question, and the nitty gritty can sometimes make it look more complicated than it is. What the federal processor wants to do, I want you to think of the FAFSA as far as financials are concerned. I want you to think of two large columns. Column number one is the parent column. They want to look at any income, both taxable and untaxed, coming into the parental household, and they want to take a percentage of that. Then they want to look at the parent's assets and take a percentage of that. Then in the other column, they want to look at the student's income, take a percentage of that. Any assets under the student, take a percentage of that. Put the two together, and that's what forms that expected family contribution. So sometimes when you look at it from a higher level view, and that just question by question, you get a better understanding of what they're doing and why they're asking these particular questions. And that's what's going on in the actual process to develop that expected family contribution that I talked about to you previously.
If your student did not file, you're going to put 0. If they
Right.
most likely, they might not have even made up to $5,000 during their summer job or at their part-time. So if they never submitted, they're likely, like for example, if I worked at Cheesecake Factory at Menlo for the summer as a hostess, I would have gotten a W-2. But it would be determined by my father's tax person, that his accountant, that doesn't make a dent in terms of when he's filing jointly, right? Because we do have situations where there are multiple W-2s being filed when you're filing your taxes, like my sister, mine, my whole family's. But if it doesn't exceed 5,000, it's not going to be reported in your taxes. So you can basically, in this next section about student financials, how, Mr. Iacovelli, how much in terms of how exact for the checking and savings, right? And this is separate, right? This is not the joint checking and savings account for, you know, both parent and students, because most of our students, they may share an account, they're minors with their parents.
Right.
So you want to make sure it doesn't get double counted when you
That's
are
correct. And
putting.
if the parental name is on it, it should go under the parents. If it's purely just the students and only the student's name, then put it down as a student asset. When you're doing, I want everyone to mention, to understand this too, when they're doing their calculations under federal methodology, okay, the thing that is taxed the most is student assets. They look at student assets and they'll take 20% of whatever it is to go towards that EFC, as opposed to a parental asset, which, depending on the age of the oldest wage earner, could be as little as 2% or as high as 3.25%, depending on their age. So again, the accuracy here is important, and not to double count. Yeah, but if there are dual accounts and the parent name is on the student's account, well, then you only want to put it one place because the parent's name is on it. Put it into the parent assets, not the student asset. They're going to take 20% on any student asset to go towards the EFC.
I wanted to circle back. We had a question about whether you can just clarify on what assets consists of. This is going back to the parental financials.
Okay,
How
and parental, yeah, and that's a good question. Anything that is not in a certified retirement plan goes down as an asset. Let me repeat that. Anything that is not in a certified, recognized financial aid, a retirement tool, let's say it's a 401k or an IRA, that goes down then as the asset, because the IRAs and the 401ks do not go as an asset. The FAFSA is clear about that. Now, Css Profile may ask for that, but when you're filing the FAFSA, so checking account, savings accounts, if you own any stocks or bonds that are not in a retirement vehicle, these are the types of assets that your parent would claim on there. If they have real estate, the FAFSA does not ask for the worth of your primary home. However, if you own other properties, whether it's rental properties or some other types of properties, maybe you have a house in the mountains or a house down at the shore, then yes, that is something that they are asking about, and that's considered a property asset. So again, any asset that is not under some type of a retirement plan, 401k, IRA, those types of things, Roth, any of those things, there's like 5, 6, 7 of them, they go down as the parental asset. And of course, it's the worth of them as you're sitting there now filing out the form.
So we're back on to the student information.
Okay.
So just making sure that as you're filing, as you're going through each page of the application, you just want to make note of the top left, that you were, because some of the questions are very similar. We had a question before regarding child support or, received for if you have any dependents, right? We had that as a parent question. Now they're asking the same question for the student side, whether or not the student is married, whether the student has any dependents, received any child supports, or had any housing or food and living allowances paid to members of military. This is still pertaining to students.
Right.
The student
because
side.
again, they're like I said with my 2 columns. In column 1, they're looking at the parental income, whether it's earned, whether it's taxable or non-taxable, and they're doing the same thing on the student side. They're doing the exact same thing on both. It's just that because you're a dependent, the student side's not going to have as much data on it, obviously, as the parent side will. But they're as thorough as they possibly can to see what, or if anything, that you may have. And the other reason for that is there are students who are dependent. Who are independent, excuse me. and they're asking the same question. So the form is used for both dependent and independent students. And so there's a consistency there in what they're asking. And those questions become very pertinent if you were truly an independent.
So for the next page, oh, so sorry, let me go back. How accurate, Mr. Iacovelli, for the students, does it have to be to the exact dollar amount for checking and savings for their little student account that they have?
I wouldn't sweat that. You know, whether you, let's say you have $1,000 in the account, whether you put $1,000 or $1,008, I'm not sweating that. If you had the 1,000 and you decide I'm not going to put it in there, then obviously you're cheating the system. But you know, as far as rounding it to the nearest 100 or whatever, that's never a problem, and no one's ever going to contradict you on that, because it's what it is now at that present time.
Thank you. I had a question. So before we get to the final step of signing and submitting, I do have a few more parent questions about assets, your specialty in terms of investments. So I think that actually pertains to the second question here about the network of investments, including real estate that's not your home. So if you own a rental property but don't know how much is worth, do you put an estimate because you have a mortgage? Or
What you do with any real estate property is you take what the market value is, and I do not accept that someone's going to tell me when they're filing a FAFSA that they're ignorant of what the market value of their asset is. First of all, I can't accept that. I don't know of anyone who's smart enough to buy real estate, but then dumb enough to not know what it's worth. So I take that out of hand. And then you also know what your mortgage is on it. So if the property's worth $300,000 and you have a $150,000 mortgage on it, you subtract it out and the asset is $150,000. I own this property, and when I take the mortgage that I still owe on it away, I have an asset of $150,000 in real estate, and it's that easy. If it's a business that you own and you own the store, same difference. What would you sell the store for? What's the mortgage on it? Subtract the two. There's the worth of the real estate on that particular business. Okay. Very upfront, very easy with that. And then, like I said, any of those investments, if it's stocks or bonds or anything like that, and it's not specifically in where you can show that it's in a retirement tool, then that's an asset that they would want to see and calculate off of.
Did you, in terms of Roth IRAs, would that be considered an asset to be included on?
No, a Roth is one of the ones that I just mentioned too. I use that as a sleight of hand example. Roth means that you have it in an IRA, a retirement vehicle. Roth is a retirement vehicle, just like an IRA or a 401k or something like that would be. So that would not have to go on the FAFSA.
401ks and Roth IRAs, any investments for the retirement does not need to be included on the FAFSA.
Correct.
Thank you.
Everything else has to.
Are you a preparer? This is rare. So there's sometimes that you can go to an accountant in order to prepare. So they will ask you whether or not you're a preparer. You're a third party.
Right. And if you are, then you go from 70% to 100%. You will be going through the federal verification process.
This is what it will contain. It would be a summary of your responses before you click submit. And again, you will see that the responses will match the questions and the lines.
That's right. And let me add something here. What you're looking at right now, that's what your ESAR, your electronic student aid report, looks almost exactly like this when they send it back to you.
Right.
It's their way of recognizing to you to let you know, yeah, we got it, we processed it. And then if you wanted to send it to more schools, you could off of that. But this is their way of communicating back to you to to say to you, here's the numbers that you gave us. I hope they're correct. Check them over.
We had a question about foreign assets as
Mhm.
well as FBAR.
It's fine. I see the thing. The foreign assets, no matter what country they're in, you convert it into a dollar form, and yes, it's an asset.
You would put an approximate amount.
You put in the approximate amount. I own stocks in the London Stock Exchange. I own stocks in the Singapore Stock Exchange. All right, good. Convert it into dollars. You know, in England, it's worth 100,000 pounds. Okay, what? Convert it to dollars. It's your assets under you and your wife's name. It's your asset. It's not in a retirement type vehicle. So yes, it's your asset. It would go down on the form.
Just to verify, insurance policies, is that an asset? Or
No.
No. Okay, great. Answer that. So when we get to the very last page, you also see, we'll go back to the previous one, you'll see the list of colleges that you picked in the summary. And then you're going to click sign and submit. So when you sign and submit, as I mentioned before on the FSA ID, this is the final page.
Mhm.
Student signature is required. And the parent's signature is required. It will indicate that it is unsigned. When you go ahead and click this pencil tab here, it's going to ask you to log in again as with your FSA ID. Your FSA ID is your electronic signature because it's linked to your individual social security number.
Correct.
Again, you are using your social security number. And then you're going to click agree. It's going to ask you again, as I mentioned, in order to sign this FAFSA, it's going to ask you to log in with your FSA ID again. And then same with parent. So which parent signs? You're gonna sign as parent 1 with your parent FSA ID. You're signing basically the primary parents. You only need one parent to make one FSA ID.
Correct.
To sign. You only need one parent. And then this will pop up, your parent's account, the parent password, and sign. Now I know that there's a red box here on the very bottom left, other options to sign. Now this is really for if you're absolutely having issues with, logging into your FSA ID, there is a paper way where you can send this to the headquarters, where you can send or fax a signature page, essentially. So we recommend signing electronically with the FSA ID so that you don't have to print and mail the signature page. But if you get to this point and you absolutely need to, there are options for you to print a signature page.
The only way that should happen is if you're, and this is a very rare situation, the only time that should happen is if your parent does not have a social security number. That's the only reason I could think of. Other than that, you should be going through the FSA ID like 999,000 out of 10 million, whatever we don't want. It should be a very, very rare occurrence that you have to go that way.
Great. So we are once again showing you that once you've logged in, there will be a green check mark on both student and parent FSA ID. And then you can go ahead and click submit your FAFSA now.
Bingo.
We'll list your last name, date of birth, everything matches. And then it'll say congratulations. And then it will also indicate the summary of which college received your.
Before we get away from that, can I draw their attention? You see the bottom left? It's in red. It says start your state application to apply for Iowa state-based stuff. Well, that's their example that they're using here. But when you click, you'll have something there. It won't say exactly what this says, but there's also one for New Jersey. So I just want everybody to be aware of that you've clicked on the FAFSA and you think you're done. There's this little section down here that you do want to click on. and they're only going to ask you 2 or 3 things that'll help HESAA in getting your data through to their financial aid management system. But I just want to make everybody aware of that they don't ignore it or miss it. Okay.
You will receive a confirmation in your email within 1 week. We had another question. So now let's, we can take additional questions in the chat box. So will the colleges I apply to have this in their system when I apply, or do I need to have something from FAFSA? So everything gets sent. You will see on the right-hand side of this PowerPoint that it will confirm that they receive this report. And which ones. So let's say you're applying, you sent this report to the 10 colleges that you've listed on FAFSA. You decide, there's additional colleges that you wish to apply to. You can always log back into the FAFSA application.
Correct.
You would have to then delete those colleges, or 1 or 2, to make room for the new institutions, and then send it that way. So again, once again, you are using the 2020 tax return for 1040, and you are going to be completing the FAFSA application. Applications should be for the year 2022-2023, because that is when you are going to be starting your freshman year in college. So yeah, we had a question about which application. When the very front page of FAFSA, it lists two different applications, one for this current school year and one for the future, the upcoming one for the fall. So you are all going to be filing for the FAFSA 2022-2023. Okay. And again, I will be uploading a updated PowerPoint on this step-by-step tutorial guide, as well as this video on our counseling webpage. So again, it will give you a step-by-step guide as we have, ran through it tonight. You can save the application. You do not have to submit it. Again, there is no deadline, but in what we previously mentioned, you want to get the application in as soon as, latest would be February. I don't know if Mr. Iacovelli, do you have any more to add in terms of the timeline? Because you can submit anytime between October through the spring, but sometimes money does run out.
Well, that question was answered before, if you remember. My personal opinion on this, after 4 decades of doing this and helping countless number of students with this, is that yes, you can start October 1st, but your personal goal is to have your FAFSA completed and submitted to the federal processor no later than Thanksgiving. I think just about in any situation, if you go beyond Thanksgiving, you're starting to hurt yourself, because schools are already starting to package, so you may miss out on things. And also, once they start sending you acceptance letters, right after that, or in with the acceptance letter, sometimes they'll be sending you a financial aid package. Well, if you didn't have your FAFSA in, they can't send the package. So that's why I say that, yeah, you can begin as early as October 1st. You don't want to go much past Thanksgiving, because the further you get away from Thanksgiving and you start getting closer to the new year, you're getting latest, and that's not good.
All right. So again, once again, pension 401ks are not considered assets. Anything regarding the future and retirement, not considered an asset that you have to report on the FAFSA. So any students who are using a visitor visa, an F1 visa, we had a question whether or not they can or should apply for the alternative application. Yeah, because
again, the F1 visa tells me that A, they're not a U.S. citizen, and B, they are not in either the I-94 or that other I-665 thing for Homeland Security. They're in neither one of those modes where they're a resident alien yet, or even have applied that way. So anybody who's here on a visa, their best bet, especially if they're going to stay in state to go to school, and they still want to file, go to HESAA.org and fill out the alternative financial aid form that they have out there, just for those Dreamer or DACA type students.
Right, but if you have an F1 and you're an international student, you are under a student visa, then that would also not apply for the
Yeah,
GRAP.
you wouldn't be able to file a free application for federal student aid if you're on an F1 visa.
If you do have, for certain state universities, however, there is, for example, Rutgers and TCNJ, they do have a residency analysis form where they can determine how many years you have been a resident in New Jersey. So miscellaneous, whether you're in the process of getting a green card or maybe your status might be changing. Oftentimes they will ask you for an affidavit and they will ask you to verify how many years you have been in New Jersey so that you may qualify for in-state tuition instead of having to pay out upstate tuition, which is typically tens of thousands of dollars more. And just to answer, does the FAFSA need to be filled in every year?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Every year you're filing a FAFSA.
Every year that you are enrolled, this is your initial time you're doing it for the 2022-2023 school year. And every year afterwards, before you register for your next year's classes, college classes, you have to do FAFSA. You have to renew because every year you're going to be filing taxes. So it always needs to be updated.
Correct.
So I like to give this example every year, a personal example. There was a time when I was a college student and I want to say my junior year, I had forgotten to file the FAFSA. So I had registered for my classes April of before junior year. And then come August, when your tuition bill gets dispersed in the student accounts under the financial office, they need to determine whether or not you are eligible for loans, for grants, scholarships, and additional aid. There's also work study eligibility. So whether or not you can work on campus to receive a certain pool of dollar amount. So my junior year, I forgot to file FAFSA, okay? They basically unenrolled me from the classes that I got. Even though I had seniority, I got to pick the classes, the right times. They unenrolled me because I didn't renew my FAFSA. So even though I had done it 3 times before for that year, they unenrolled me. But as soon as I filed the FAFSA,
They put you back in.
put you back into the classes. But I lost my work study because that was government money that ran out. I lost my work study. I still got to go to the classes. I got my loans, my student loans, my plus loans, my parent loans, but certain amounts run out. So it's good to file as soon as possible every fiscal year.
Correct.
Right. So you are using your 2020 tax return. Okay. Your 1040s. Okay. So it's always a prior year because you haven't filed your 2021 tax returns yet. I know I have not, right? And it's still 2021. So we're not there yet. So we're using our 2020. So what if you don't file taxes for a certain year? And can you reuse the previous information? So I just mentioned 2020 for your prior year. What do you say to that, John?
Well, I'm going to expand the question a little bit because what they're asking, in a sense, was already answered by you. You have to file every year. But because we're in this prior mode where we're using 2020, and especially now that we're in a pandemic era that we're in the last 2 years, you find that a lot of parents, you must file the initial FAFSA with 2020. But what if their 2021 year has been significantly worse than 2020? And the answer to that is you have to file it with 2020, and then you would contact the school and they will do what's called a federal circumstances recalculation and recalculate based on the 2021 data, which you will have proven to them that shows that you had a great reduction in your income from 2020 to 2021. And those calculations can be made, but you have to start the initial FAFSA process with the 2020 data and then make the adjustments if you feel you're worthy of an adjustment because of things that have happened in 2021 to move in that direction. So I hope that helps. But if you miss things from one year to the next, well, that's the reason why you're filing it. There's one year that you didn't file taxes, then there's another year that you did. Well, you're filing your FAFSA every year, and that will be reflected each year as you file the FAFSA. And it's actually one of the reasons why you have to file each year, because things can change from year to year.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question. And once again, this presentation will be posted on our counseling webpage. If you go to the counseling information subsection under financial aid, we will also be posting the slide, the step-by-step tutorial and steps on how to create an FSA ID. So our last question is, yes, for the tuition for scholarships, there was a question regarding if the parents are still going to be paying out of pocket, whether it's loans or directly to the institution, do you still need to file FAFSA?
If you feel you're not going to get any form of financial aid whatsoever, and you feel that you don't want to get involved with any form of financial aid whatsoever, then I would say don't file the FAFSA. However, if you're looking for loans, if you are eligible for a scholarship at a particular school, whether it's academic or athletic or whatever, you're going to find that at most schools, and I'm talking 99% of the schools, will require you to file a FAFSA. When I developed the academic scholarships at Stockton University, I still required for any student who was eligible for my academic scholarships, I still had a requirement. You must file a FAFSA that year. So again, that is a personal choice and a family choice. I recognize that. But the vast majority of students, certainly in the first year, should be filing the FAFSA. There are those cases where the parent does not want to have anything to do with it. They have the money to pay for it. They don't want their son or daughter to have any loans. I get it. Then you don't have to file the FAFSA. But the vast majority of people aren't in that category. And so you want to have that on file. And as Mrs. Muglia brought up, she had work on campus. You must file a FAFSA if you want to work on campus for most of the jobs, not all, but for most. So there's a multitude of places where the FAFSA helps the student during their 4 years at that college. And so I think you're going to find the vast majority of people, close to 90% of the folks, usually need to file the FAFSA. There's always that 10% that are on their own. I recognize that, and you won't need to file it, but the vast majority of the answer is yes, you're filing every year.
We are out of time for tonight. Thank you so much, Mr. Iacovelli, for your time this year.
Thank you. I hope it helped.
Seeing you next year. If you have any additional questions, I did post my email upon registration. When everyone registered, you received a confirmation. You can definitely post any questions that we did not address today to my email, and then I will have your counselor or our college counselors get back to you. So thank you very much, everyone.
Take care. Good evening.
Okay.